Ivoiriens, Ivoiriennes, du nord et du sud, du centre à l'ouest. Vous avez vu, on vous a prouvé aujourd'hui que toute la Côte d'Ivoire peut cohabiter, peut jouer ensemble pour un même objectif. Se qualifier pour le mondial. Vous nous avez promis que cette fête allait rassembler le peuple. Aujourd'hui, on vous demande, s'il vous plaît, on se met à genoux.
The First Ivorian Civil War was a civil conflict in the Ivory Coast, or Côte d'Ivoire, that began with a military rebellion on the 19th of September 2002 and ended with a peace agreement on the 4th of March 2007. The conflict pitted the government of Ivorian President Laurent Gbagbo against a domestic insurgency led by the Forces Nouvelles de Côte d'Ivoire, or as us English speakers know them by, the New Forces of Ivory Coast. The reason it's called the First Ivorian Civil War is because a second civil war would break out in late 2010, following the 2010 Ivorian presidential election. Now, I'm not sure about you, but the thought of a mere football team helping to cease conflict between an entire nation seems outlandish, but yes, it did actually happen. The date was the 8th of October 2005, ahead of the final 2006 World Cup qualification match. Cameroon was set to play Egypt, whilst Ivory Coast was set to play Sudan. It was simple, anything less than the Cameroon victory, and Ivory Coast would qualify for their first ever World Cup finals. A draw in Yaoundé meant the Elephants had done it. All amidst a devastating national divide, they'd qualified for the World Cup for the first time. But it was all overshadowed by the post-game actions by the Ivorians in the changing rooms, who did something that actually helped bring the nation to a long-forgotten peace just under 18 months later. Today we're going to be discussing the key aspects of the Civil War and the Ivory Coast national team's influence in bringing this initial war to an end. This is Deep Dive. Right, we're going to have to split this into many different subsections just because of the complexity of this civil war. I'll try and work through this as chronologically as I can, but I can't be sure I'll get absolutely everything in the right sequence. Also, just before we get into this, there are many French names and words in this video, so I can only apologise if I mispronounce any of them. Let's start with the history of political leadership in Ivory Coast, and more so the origins and context of the Civil War. Ivory Coast first gained independence as a nation on the 7th of August 1960 after a referendum in 1958, which saw them become an autonomous republic. Immediately after obtaining independence, Ivory Coast came under the French sphere of influence known as Francafrique. In international relations, Francafrique is France's sphere of influence over former French and Belgian colonies in sub-Saharan Africa. The term was derived from the expression France-Afrique, but was later renamed Francafrique by François-Xavier Verschave in 1998 to criticise the alleged corrupt and clandestine activities of various Franco-African political, economic and military networks, also defined as France's neocolonialism. From the beginning of their independence till his death in 1993, the country was led by Félix Houphouët-Boigny. I hope that's how you pronounce it. I'm going off a YouTube video on how to, so blame YouTube if it's wrong. During Houphouët-Boigny's reign, he had maintained Ivorian political and economic stability using mechanisms largely dependent on his own personal charisma, networks and Francafrique connections. Suffice to say, the country lacked established mechanisms to regulate democratic competition. As required by the constitution following his death, Houphouët-Boigny was succeeded by Henri Konan Bédié, the President of the National Assembly, who also replaced Houphouët-Boigny at the head of the ruling Democratic Party of Ivory Coast, or PDCI. As mentioned a moment ago, democratic competition was minimal during Houphouët-Boigny's reign. I mean, it was only in 1990 that opposition parties were even legalised, so the PDCI dominated Ivorian politics for nearly 4 decades. This trend continued in the 1995 presidential election, as despite more opposition threat, Bédié was elected in his own right after obtaining over 96% of the vote. This is really where the roots of cause to the First Civil War came into play. It's widely agreed that the main root cause of the Ivorian Civil War was the spread of nativist and xenophobic discourse, its mobilisation by opportunistic politicians, and the resulting ethnic tensions. Central in this regard was the rise of Ivoirite as an ideology and state policy under President Bédié, and its use to marginalise and exclude immigrants, their descendants, and certain groups of Ivorian citizens. Ivory Coast has historically received large numbers of immigrants from neighbouring West African countries, especially Burkina Faso, and the flow of immigration was sustained after independence due to Ivory Coast's relative prosperity and due to the favourable policies of Houphouët-Boigny's government. For example, between 1960 and 1972, any person born in Ivory Coast could receive an Ivorian citizenship, regardless of their parents' nationality. In November 1994, ahead of the 1995 presidential election, Bédié had the National Assembly amend the electoral code to require that presidential candidates should be Ivorian-born of 2 Ivorian-born parents, where previously only 1 such parent had been required. This was viewed as a strategic move to avert a leadership challenge from Alassane Ouattara, current president of Ivory Coast, but at the time was Bédié's rival inside PDCI. Bede ruled until December 1999, where he was deposed in a coup led by Tuo Vossier that then saw former army commander Robert Gué, although not having led the coup d'etat, getting called out of retirement as head of a National Public Salvation Committee and becoming the new president of Ivory Coast. Gué said that the new military government would seek to reverse Bede's changes to the electoral code. However, the opposite occurred, and in July 2000 the Ivory Coast adopted a constitutional amendment which would permanently restrict eligibility for the presidency of those of Ivorian origin born of a father and mother who are also Ivorian by birth. This basically meant that only one major opposition leader, Laurent Gbagbo, could challenge for presidency in 2000 against Gué, and obviously Gbagbo won because the only reason Gué had power was because of a coup, and his 10-month reign came to an end. His reign did end peacefully though, as Gué refused to cede power to him until forced to do so by violent public protests, in which 206 people were killed and 1,207 were injured. To be frank, the political transition to Gbagbo's government did little to ease ethnic tensions. The mood in the military remained generally mutinous, and Gbagbo faced opposition from both Gué loyalists and Ouattara sympathisers within the army. An attempted coup in January 2001, which Gbagbo blamed on the interference of Burkina Faso, led to renewed attacks on Burkinabe residents by Ivorian Popular Front, or FPI supporters. But to conclude, Gbagbo had power going into the civil war and had, well, I was about to say he had control, but he didn't really, did he? Right, okay, the start of the civil war. The opening salvo in the war was a rebellion against Gbagbo's government by Ivorian troops who on the 19th of September 2002 executed a well-coordinated simultaneous attack on 3 Ivorian cities, including the largest city, Abidjan. It was reportedly planned by former Pro-Rally of the Republicans, or RDR, or pro-Gué dissidents in the military, and then the Student Federation of Ivory Coast. According to the International Crisis Group, the rebellion involved about 750 troops. Just 3 days later, France launched Operation Licorne with an initial mandate focused on protecting and evacuating French nationals and other foreign nationals. Indeed, in the weeks after the rebellion, French and American forces evacuated 2,500 people, mostly foreign nationals, from the Ivory Coast. This conflict continued to intensify as both sides recruited and armed thousands of civilians and, on the government side, contracted foreign mercenaries. However, on September the 29th, the Economic Community of West African States, or ECOWAS, launched peace negotiations in Ghana under the mediation of a high-level contact group comprising representatives from Ghana, Guinea-Bissau, Mali, Niger, Nigeria, and Togo. Further talks were held in Togo in October and November, but failed to break a political deadlock. The Patriotic Movement of Ivory Coast, or MPCI, demanded 3 things: Gbagbo's removal, fresh elections, and a review of the constitution. By the middle of December 2002, 400 people had died in the conflict and 100,000 more had been displaced. In December, the rebels regrouped politically with the Movement for Justice and Peace, or MJP, and the Ivorian Popular Movement of the Great West, or MPIGO, joined MPCI as junior partners in a new political coalition, the New Forces of Ivory Coast, or FNCI, led by Guillaume Soro of the MPCI. Too many movements, too many abbreviations. I hope this is making sense, but it probably isn't. From the 15th to the 26th of January 2003, the various parties, government, rebel forces, and opposition political parties met at Lina Marcoussis near Paris to undertake substantive peace negotiations. The parties signed a compromise peace agreement, the Lina Marcoussis Accord, on the 26th of January. Now, this is when your mind will probably explode. The power-sharing government would include representation for all of the agreement signatories. These signatories include the 3 major political parties, these being Bede's PDCI, Ouattara's RDR, and Gbagbo's FDI, the 3 major rebel groups in the New Forces, the MPCI, the MJP, and the MPIGO, and 4 smaller political parties, the Movement of the Forces of the Future, the Ivorian Workers' Party, the Citizens Democratic Union, and the Union for Democracy and Peace in Ivory Coast. Head explosion over, moving on swiftly. In a pattern that would be maintained in subsequent years, the signature of the Lina Marcoussis Accord was followed by significant delays in its implementation, requiring the reopening of peace talks. Through the Lina Marcoussis Accord remained the basic framework within which all such talks took place between 2003 and 2006. On the 7th to the 8th of March 2003, the first implementation stalemate was temporarily resolved during another summit in Accra, organised by ECOWAS and mediated by Ghanaian President John Kufuor. The party signed a comprehensive ceasefire on the 3rd of May, and the same day the UN Security Council passed Resolution 1479, which established the UN Mission in Côte d'Ivoire, the MINUCI, to monitor implementation of the Lina Marcoussis Accord. On the 4th of July 2003, the government and the New Forces announced publicly that the civil war was over, that they had agreed to work together to implement the peace agreement. It was over, all in less than a year. wasn't it? Of course it wasn't, because things are never easy in politics. On the 25th of March 2004, opposition parties organised a public demonstration in Abidjan to call on the government to implement the Lina Marcoussis Accord. In response, the security forces and pro-government militias opened fire on the demonstrators, while other opposition supporters were rounded up by militias in subsequent days. In May, an inquiry into the march and aftermath found that at least 120 people were killed, 274 were wounded, and 20 had disappeared. Peace talks resumed in July 2004 in Accra in an attempt to revitalise the peace process. However, by October, it was apparent that the Accra III agreement had not broken the implementation deadlock. On the 4th of November, Gbagbo's forces violated the prevailing ceasefire as the military launched air attacks against rebel positions in Bouaké and Kwahogo. The Young Patriots launched another attack on the new forces' residence at the Hotel de Golf, expelling Prime Minister Diarra. After the attacks, Soro of the new forces declared the Lina Marcoussis Accord and subsequent Accra agreements null and void. France and Ivory Coast continued to clash for the next 10 days, with numerous bombings and casualties, forcing the UN Security Council to pass Resolution 1572 on the 15th of November, imposing an immediate arms embargo on Ivory Coast, though the effectiveness of the embargo is debatable. Election preparations were slow, even as the end of Gbagbo's 5-year presidential term on the 30th of October 2005 approached. In early September, both the new forces and the opposition parties said that elections held on the 30th of October as planned would not be free and fair. In early October, the AU's Peace and Security Council conceded that Gbagbo would remain in office for up to 12 months further. Finally, we reached the part where the Ivorian national team get involved. As we've said, the date was the 8th of October 2005. The mathematics of qualification for World Cup 2006 was so simple. A win for Cameroon against Egypt would see them reach their 6th tournament. Anything less would allow Ivory Coast, playing Sudan and just a point behind, to leapfrog them and qualify instead for the first time. Cameroon's match against Egypt in Yaoundé and Ivory Coast's fixture with Sudan kicked off simultaneously. Ivory Coast, knowing nothing less than a victory would do, made short work of a Sudanese side second bottom in the group. In the 73rd minute, Aruna Dindane tucked away his second goal, and their team's third. An 89th minute Sudanese strike was no more than a consolation. Events were unfolding relatively straightforwardly, but nearly 1600 miles away in Yaoundé, the picture was very different. Cameroon took the lead in the 20th minute, but the game was tight. At 79th minute equaliser bundled in by Mohamed Shorki brought Egypt level and swung the tide back into the Ivorians' favour. A draw, so long as they beat Sudan, would see them qualify. With just seconds remaining and with the score locked at 1-1, Ivory Coast looked set for their maiden trip to the World Cup. The match as Sudan had finished, Drogba was standing surrounded by his teammates, they were all listening to the radio and waiting. Then the crushing news filtered through. Cameroon had been awarded a soft penalty in the 4th minute of injury time. For every tale of heartbreak, there must be one of joy. Prayer Wame's spot kick crashed against the left-hand post and flew wide. Ivory Coast erupted. For the first time in their history, they would compete at the highest level of international football. For all the breathless footballing drama that took place that night, the most seismic event did not occur on the football pitch, and in the cramped away dressing room at the Al Malik Stadium. With the celebrations unfolding, a TV camera was ushered into the changing room. The players huddled before it, their arms draped across each other's shoulders. Standing in the centre, microphone in hand, was the imposing figure of Didier Drogba.
Ivoiriens, du nord et du sud, du centre à l'ouest. Vous avez vu, on vous a prouvé aujourd'hui que toute la Côte d'Ivoire peut cohabiter, peut jouer ensemble pour un même objectif, se qualifier pour le mondial. Vous nous avez promis que cette fête allait rassembler le peuple. Aujourd'hui, on vous demande, s'il vous plaît, on se met à genoux.
Political complexities aside, there was finally a group of high-profile Ivorians speaking some sense to the rest of the nation. Drogba urged his fellow Ivorians, "The one country in Africa with so many riches must not descend into war. Please lay down your weapons and hold elections." Whilst the message didn't do much initially, the media exposure it received in the following months made it a key reason why the civil war came to an end just 2 years later. Shortly after the UN Security Council adopted Resolution 1721, Gbagbo announced he was preparing his new own framework to resolve the crisis, reflecting that, confronted by the failure of external solutions, it is time for Ivorians to assume total ownership of the peace process. The new framework revolved around direct dialogue between the new forces and Gbagbo's FPI to be undertaken bilaterally without international mediation. Although touted as a homegrown solution, the talks were facilitated by Burkinabe President Blaise Compaoré with ECOWAS's endorsement. None of the opposition parties were invited to participate, and Gbagbo and Soro held direct talks alone for the first time. It took over 4 years for Gbagbo and Soro to hold direct talks alone for the first time. No wonder the civil war dragged on for so long. And finally, on the 4th of March 2007, the parties, the FBI government and the new forces, signed the Ouagadougou peace agreement in Burkina Faso, their 8th peace agreement since 2002. The agreement, which represented a comprehensive political settlement to the conflict, entailed a new power-sharing arrangement, abandoning the notion of a consensus prime minister. Instead, Soro was to become prime minister, thus marginalising opposition leaders Ouattara and Bede, but Gbagbo's constitutional prerogatives as president were also to be re-established. According to 2009 estimates by the Uppsala Conflict Data Programme, in its deadliest years between 2002 and 2004, the war had between 933 and 1,689 casualties, with a best guess of 1,265. UNOCI suffered 36 casualties during the war, 15 in 2005, 13 in 2006 and 8 in 2007. According to the UN Refugee Agency, approximately 750,000 people were forcibly displaced between 2002 and 2007, including 50,000 refugees who fled primarily to Liberia, Guinea and Mali. So what we learned from Gbagbo's leadership turned an already frantic nation into a political frenzy for nearly a decade, which is why when the 2010 presidential election winner was Gbagbo, they weren't happy in the slightest, were they? A huge dispute over the result led to crisis and to the beginning of the Second Ivorian Civil War. Soro did not run in this election, nor did the new forces endorse a candidate. The Independent Electoral Commission declared Ouattara the winner, but both Gbagbo and Ouattara claimed victory and took the presidential oath of office. Hundreds of people were killed in the violence that followed, and hundreds of thousands were displaced yet again. UN Security Council Resolution 1962 extended UNOCI's mandate and called on all parties to recognise Ouattara as Ivory Coast's rightful president. The Second Civil War ended with Gbagbo's defeat and arrest in April 2011, but despite its brevity, had a higher death toll than the first. A 2012 National Commission of Inquiry recorded 3,248 fatalities. But what surprised me the most from this is that a 1-minute plea from a few Ivorians changed the outlook on a civil war that had ripped through the country for many years prior. Drogba's done many things in his career. He recovered from malaria in around an hour, he made Arsenal fans' life a living hell, he made Gary Neville go. But the one thing I didn't expect is for him to nearly single-handedly prevent a civil war from getting any worse. I must say, it took me a long time to make this video, through the hours of research and hours of editing, so any support would be greatly appreciated if you made it this far. To research and get an understanding of a 5-year civil war in a few hours is difficult, and I'll be completely honest, I still don't get some of the parts of it, so I will also say any added knowledge of this and any parts I missed would be greatly appreciated. A completely different style of video for you guys today, and something I'm a little less knowledgeable on, so I hope you guys enjoy regardless, and like I said previously, any support would go a long way. Cheers.